Welcome to Methods in Sinology, and today is our last session for this semester. Our today's speaker is Thomas Milani, who is a professor of Chinese history at Stanford University and a Guggenheim Fellow. Professor Milani has quite an online presence, so I'm pretty sure that everyone present already knows about him. So I will keep my introduction very short. He earned his bachelor and master degrees from the Johns Hopkins University and his PhD from Columbia University. Since then, he has been a prolific researcher and writer, publishing both monographs and shorter articles for multiple academic and non-academic journals and newspapers. Among his more prominent publications are, for example, The Chinese Typewriter, A History, published in 2017, and Coming to Terms with the Nation, Ethnic Classification in Modern China, published in 2010. One of the reasons we are so happy to have Professor Milani with us today is because the goals of several of his projects are quite close to what we are trying to do with this lecture series. That is to take a closer look at how academia and the process of research function. In this relation, I should definitely mention his more recent co-authored book, Where Research Begins, Choosing a Research Project That Matters to You and the World. And there are also several other projects, such as the Mentorship Program, YouTube, and even TikTok accounts under the name of First Gen Professor. And you should definitely check them out. And this is all from me for now, and I'm handing the floor to our guest. Thank you.
Well, hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to meet everyone and to be here with you. And thank you for negotiating the time difference and doing this in your evening. So for many, so thanks for that. And I want to, thank this invitation. I've been looking forward to this for quite a long time, and I'm glad it's really happening. We've been, I was excited to receive this invitation, and I really am an admirer and in awe of the series and the idea for it and the execution of it. So it's an honor to be here. So my understanding is that, we're kind of in a discussion right now that sits somewhere in between what might be described as almost professional development, but then also research methodology. That's, I think, the space in which I've been asked to come in and to share some thoughts, and above all, to field questions. And so that's what I'm striving to do. I have a kind of an architecture to it, but my greatest anxiety in life is being completely useless. And so, I'm purely here to make sure that there is something of value to hopefully everyone. And so if you don't feel that the concerns you come to this event are being addressed, please just put them in the chat, and then I can figure out whether or not there's something I'm already planning on saying that's going to address, or there's so much to cover that I just want to make sure that I'm speaking anywhere in the neighborhood of your concerns. Let me go ahead and share my screen so we can see this. I'm not going to do full screen because full screen often sort of messes with my life when I'm on Zoom. So I'm going to go ahead, and you should be able to see just my Acrobat screen now.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Adobe Acrobat quit unexpectedly. No, it didn't. Okay, I'm going to assume that you can still see it. All right. So I basically have divided what I'd like to begin by addressing into two zones, and one that really thinks about grad school, and then another which thinks about those of you that are either right at the cusp of going to, between basically ABD and early career. So thinking really of graduate school and these foundations, and I'll come back to this, and then thinking about the transition from ABD, which is largely a North American designation or concept, obviously, of all but dissertation. That is, the coursework phase is over in the North American context, and that one is now fully in a dissertation phase, which, of course, in many European PhD programs is the entirety of the program, of course, but how one makes the transition from being a student, a graduate student, to a colleague, whether that be in the context of a postdoc or a teaching position or something of that nature. And that transition is quite awkward and quite challenging to navigate, and there are very few guideposts on how to do it. So let me just give you a sense of some of the things that I have in mind for the first of these phases and for the second of these. And then really I'm going to rely upon everyone in the chat to steer me towards, prioritizing their own concerns, because I don't think that we're going to have time to cover just everything. And I don't want to fire hose you all. And so here's what, is possibly on the menu, and then we can start to, route it as needed. There is the element, obviously, of research. So this is the graduate's dimension of it. And there's a series of issues that surround the research process, which I've identified here, not in terms of methodology, but almost with a focus on challenges, pitfalls, minefields that I have walked through myself and that I see many students walk through that get in the way of deepening their research. Probably one of the most important is the almost pathological desire that we all have of reapplying to the same graduate school that has already accepted us. That is, instead of feeling the safety of being in a program and making use of this new structured environment in which to delve into research in a really inarticulate way, a very vulnerable way, a very exploratory way, that we spend a lot of our time, and many grad students spend a lot of their time basically trying to reconvince their instructors and their faculty and so forth that they are smart enough to be there. So we basically end up reapplying over and over and over with every conversation we have to the graduate school that, technically speaking, already let us in. And this is so-called imposter syndrome. It's cause for anxiety, and that's all true, and that's kind of reason enough to think about it. But there's also a key dimension where this can become a major obstacle towards the discovery of one's actual research and dissertation or thesis topic. When one tries to perform their intelligence with every single meeting and basically leaves no space to be inarticulate, they can very quickly wake up one day in year 3, 4, 5, in the North American context, 7 of the program, and realize that they still have really no idea what it is and why it is that they're doing. So research of this whole big bucket of stuff that I'd like to make sure to piece together. For those whose graduate programs entail coursework, which I know is not everybody, I'd like to maybe touch just briefly upon how coursework in the graduate school or more advanced phases of research differ in many fundamental ways from the kinds of decisions we make in other stages of academic career. In short, graduate school coursework selection is completely different and guided by completely different principles than the selection of coursework in undergraduate contexts. In a nutshell, when one is taking courses at the graduate school level, one should really be using them as a way to build their mentorship team, build their committees, build their dissertation committees, build their mentorship networks, and using the course as, in essence, a mechanism of auditioning, of seeing who you might want to have as a lifelong mentor. And that's very different from the undergraduate mindset, which is almost purely on the basis of the title of the course. Is it required? Does it fulfill this credit requirement? It's the description of the course, the reading list. These very almost undergrads very rarely make their decision based upon almost who is teaching the course, with the idea of auditioning a lifelong mentor. So I'd like to talk about that. And then something that is becoming probably, I would say, is reaching crisis level proportions is mental health in graduate school. This has always been a problem, always been an issue, but I will say that being on this side of like the classroom, that the prevalence of mental health related issues, stalling, stagnation, students sort of disappearing from the classroom and re-entering I have never seen it at this scale. I think it's a mixture of a lot of different things, some proximate, like the pandemic, but some that are more secular and grinding, like economic conditions or political conditions. And basically mental health really doesn't begin in graduate school. Mental health should not begin when you have a crisis, in the same sense that, you don't go to the grocery store when you're starving. You don't wait until the crisis moment to start thinking about certain aspects of your life. And I think that we all need to do a much better job institutionally, especially as advisors, as mentors, to remind people that when day one or day two of arriving in a program, you find, where the laundromat is, where the cafe is, where the bathroom is in the department, and how and where to seek out mental health support well before you need it. And then lastly, in this section, I'd like to also think about the resources that I have seen almost systematically underutilized by students in graduate school in early phases of the process, or early phases of the program. And this is true, I think, regardless of whether or not there is a coursework phase or straight into dissertation. And probably the most important one is the lack of exchange in any systematic way between complete fresh through the door first day graduate students and then third, fourth, fifth, or in the North American context, sixth, seventh year graduate students. There is almost no bridge between these individuals. They don't know each other exist because they are in completely different life phases. And that's true. And that it's to be expected, but there is so much possibility for mentorship, guidance, sort of gut checks, that is there in between students of different phases that goes really underutilized in a systematic way. Institutions need to do a better job of that, but until institutions do, unfortunately, it's kind of on students themselves to seek out these possibilities. So this is the general thing. You can see these other dimensions there as you read these slides. This is the graduate student stuff that I want to talk about within the idea of surviving, graduate school within Sinology and building a career and thriving. And then within the ABD context, or the transition from student to colleague, there are a few different dimensions that really want to talk about. One is when the essential importance of building a mentorship network that extends beyond your home institution. I will say, and I can give you a sort of preview of this dimension, I have the job I have now out of a million different chance coincidences and strokes of luck and work. But I know for a fact that the last call that was made by the committee that ended up recommending me to be hired called someone who was not at Stanford to try to basically check if I was, for lack of a better word, the real deal. They just, a search committee fundamentally does not know the research of those that they hire, because chances are they're going to hire someone who is working in some capacity that goes beyond their expertise. That's kind of a natural structural feature. And because of that, there is always this deep, existential doubt that they look good on paper, they gave a good talk, but this is a commitment. We're making a big commitment here. How do we check and see? And the phone call that was made was not to my advisor at Columbia, for obvious reasons, because no advisor who has your best interest is going to say, yeah, don't hire them. Instead, it was to a third party. I won't say who it was, but it was someone completely out of any, ostensible, obvious network that would have any connection to me. But as it stood, this person really did know my work because years and years before, I had not like pathologically preparing for this moment, like in some sort of like, I'm going to run for office in 30 years. So I have to start making my network, like in a sort of Bill Clinton-y kind of way, but out of sincere desire to build an intellectual network of mentors that went far beyond my institution. This person knew me really well and knew my manuscript and knew my research. And so was able to say, yes, I kind of give this person my stamp of approval. If this person, they were not a letter writer, none of that. It was just a complete third party person, but this person knew me. Maybe if they didn't know me, they still would have, looked over my work and given a blessing. But I know, through the grapevine that this happened. And this is just goes to speak to the kinds of reasons and meanings that we really need to think from a pretty early stage, maybe in a North American context, like a third year, fourth year, but in a dissertation only program, as soon as you're sort of in the thick of it, you want to start thinking about building these mentors out. So that's one part of the transition I'd like to focus on. The defense and what one does when they have a dissertation, and like, what is a dissertation and what is its relationship to a book? I think there's a lot of confusion around that. I think for anyone who's ever seen any of the videos that I've tried to make, I really strongly encourage people to stop reading books, by which it's a facetious way of saying that I know in my case, when I was at Columbia, I read probably all told 3 dissertations, and one of them was mine, and 2 of them were my writing partners. And I never went into Columbia special collections and read the dissertations of, Columbia grad students before me, or of people who are now professors at other places who, did their work 30 years ago at Columbia. So and I know this to be true for the vast majority of graduate students. The vast majority of graduate students that I've spoken to have read like 0, 1, 2 dissertations. Yet we are in a field whose primary genre is the dissertation. So instead, what we do is we read books that have gone through extensive post-dissertation, if it's a book based upon the dissertation, extensive post-dissertation revision, peer review, years of maybe further research, further archival work, and then we end up comparing ourselves to that. So if you read Prasenjit Dwara's first book, this 2 for Levinson and Fairbank winning first book, one could reasonably come to the conclusion that there is a snowball's chance in hell that I could do this. There's no way that I could write this. And you start to despair. If you go and you read the dissertation that Dwara's first book is based on, you will be impressed, but you will feel, I think I might be able to do this. It's sort of bloated in certain parts. It's less sharp. There some revision is needed. It goes on when it's made its point. It does all the things that dissertations do. And when you see that and you realize that's my North Star, I mean, maybe you don't have to do a dissertation as good as that, but that's my North Star. And that actually is within the bounds. But instead we read, I don't know, The Great Divergence, or we read we read The Cheese and the Worms, if it's an introduction to history and historiography, The Making of the English Working Class. And, you leave these works saying, this is impossible. This is impossible. But what we need to start doing systematically is understanding that the genre of the dissertation is its own animal. It is not a book. And so that's another thing that I think it'd be fun for us to talk about if that's of interest. The first book, obviously this is a sinological discussion. This is a Chinese history, Chinese civilization, culture studies, maybe literary and cultural history kind of crowd is my understanding. So we are a book community. That is a unit of measurement in many of our lives and many of our career paths. And so there is the process of what it actually looks like to publish a book. I'm kind of surprised, but also not surprised at all, that almost no one really knows what the publishing process actually entails. And so I think it'd be nice to just bang, 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 lay that out and really understand it. But also for another reason, which is that when you lay out the publication process start to finish, you realize that there are 3 chances in the publication process for nearly wholesale revision of your manuscript. Many of us imagine, I know I thought it, and I've had, I don't know how many hundreds of conversations with graduate students or recently defended dissertations who think this. They think that when they hand in their manuscript to the press, that someone at the press like gets out their chisel and is like, okay, let me carve this in the side of the building for perpetuity. And so there's this anxiety for the author, understandably, about this being almost an immaculate, unassailable object, when in fact the process is going to give you 2 to 3 chances to completely revise, in certain sense, the manuscript before it is committed to a page proof. So I thought we should talk about that. And then if anyone here, I don't know the highest career stage here, but if anyone is thinking about their second project, I don't know if you are, chances are many of you at the end of graduate school have started thinking about this, because you've probably heard, this is what I need to include in my job application material. I need to give them a trajectory. A postdoc application needs to maybe perhaps speak to a second project. And so I thought that that would be something that it would be worthwhile addressing. Now, I've not mentioned China, Sinology. Just know that, of course, I'm a China historian, and that any and all questions that we're talking about here reverberate within our field, it's not a field, it's a cluster of fields. But I'm also happy to address if you think of any kind of China-specific issues, sinologically specific issues that come to mind, whether it be about archival access, whether it be about language training, whether it be about any number of things. So my first question, I'm sorry to kick the can right back to you, but having sort of, I'm the waiter that just came to your table, and I said, so our specials today, we have a nice halibut. We also have a this and a that. Maybe if someone could brave the chat and let me know, where would you like me to begin? I can begin in any one of these points, and then we can navigate our way through. But I really want to make sure that right from the beginning, I'm somewhere within the zone of your concern. So I'll just watch the chat for a moment.
I will also break the silence while people type. I seem so from asking, ABD, there are a lot of ABD people today, or people writing the dissertation. Perhaps that is where we can start. Okay.
All right. Thesis to book, ABD. All right. Okay. Yeah. So generally that zone to begin with. All right. Let's start there. So the let's begin really pragmatically, and this is the question about the phases of this completely unstructured time. ABD, all but dissertation, is you have effectively escaped all of the traps, except one, that institutions lay down in order to systematically exclude those that they understand as failing a program. So orals, or comprehensive examinations, is a way to jettison people from academia. That's one of its mechanisms. It has another mechanism, another point, but that is one of the mechanisms. You remain in the sort of student position of this, where there's quite literally an exam that, when one passes or doesn't pass, has ramifications, obviously. And then your coursework phase for those that are in coursework-based programs. Once you are ABD, you have entered this liminal zone where you are no longer subject to any of these mechanisms. You are unfailable, and that's why I have that thing at first here. But you're not infallible. So you're in this weird zone where you have almost started the process. And in fact, I would say you have started the process of the transition from a student to a colleague. And what do I mean by that? Well, when I have an advisee, if I'm a primary advisor or a secondary advisor, and I'll pause the screen share for just a second, because I don't think we need it to be up there as I'm saying this. When I have a student, either primary advisee or secondary advisee, who moves into this phase, one is that I mean, it's not as if I think of it in this way, but I lose any mechanism, and everyone around me loses any mechanism short of some sort of like legal violation of jettisoning them from the program. They are now, they have a kind of permanence, of course, that is governed by the length of the program, the total length of the funding package, and things of that nature. But we've stepped out of this classic professor-student relationship that has governed how all of us go through education systems from the time we're like in kindergarten. So kindergarten to ABD is like one unit of time in some weird way. And now we've entered this different zone where you're kind of a junior colleague, and you're a junior colleague in another way as well, which is by this moment, yes, you in a coursework-based program, you have been doing a lot of things besides your dissertation research, obviously. So it's not a dissertating moment, but you have done probably research seminar papers, paper for classes, your own independent research, and you have probably entered a place with your own research area or topic where your subject expertise surpasses that of your instructor. And your instructor knows this. I've had students, just thematically, whose content and subject awareness of their project far exceeds my knowledge of their subject. And it's very common where you have a student who works in languages that you yourself don't have. I have students who work in Russian. I don't work in Russian. And so we're in this relationship where I have to almost deal with conversations with them as a colleague, rather than someone who can adjudicate everything that's being said in a kind of, final exam sort of way. And that needs to be embraced, because that process of stepping out of the role of thinking of oneself exclusively as a student passing through various gauntlets and flaming hoops is a transition that you have to make. Because when the time comes, this is the sort of first frame I'd like to present, when the time comes for you to sit down with potential real colleagues, I'm assuming everyone at least has the inclination to have a career in academia, meaning go on to teach and to do research. If you want to step into that kind of role, those institutions do not want to hire a student. They want to hire a colleague. And if a person exudes a kind of hyper student mentality in campus visits or in conduct or in these sort of exchanges, it can send up cautionary flags to a committee in some ways. They understand the asymmetries, but it can also create these doubts in one's mind about whether or not a person is sort of ready to get into the boat and start oaring and start rowing, because you're no longer, this is no longer a dependent. It's actually someone who is part of the institution at that point, will have students of their own, advisees of their own, responsibilities of their own. And so one thing that we don't often talk about is how to start making that transition almost as soon as one enters into the ABD, all but dissertation phase. That's an informal action. That's a meaning hallway conversations, the participation in Q&A when other visiting scholars come and you are one of the audience members alongside other faculty in your department. It happens in 1,000 different venues, but it's your chance to start play acting the role of what it's going to be like to be a colleague, a junior colleague, and there's still asymmetries of power, but a colleague. That's one dimension of it. The other, which is another concrete, but then cycles back into the sort of intellectual work we do, is what are exactly the subdivisions of ABD? Meaning, what is the natural, architecture of it? It's not a two-state, a bi-state phenomenon of you're dissertating and then you're done. You're dissertating and then you defend. There are many strata or zones in between. One of these benchmark moments is, and probably some of you are in this now or maybe have just gone through it, is when you take that inchoate mass of material that you have accumulated and read and thought through, and most of it you haven't read through. When you take that and for the first time, you start to schematize it into something like a table of contents. And the most that's sort of an important zone, but most important of all is when you feel confident that you can carve off some subset of that and say, I'm going to draw a dotted line around this, and this is the beginnings of a chapter. It doesn't have to be chapter 1. It could be chapter 3. It could be chapter 2. It could be chapter 4. In fact, you want to make that decision on the basis of where you have the capacity to make that. You do not want to impose a linearity to the writing process if you're not ready to write chapter 1. But that act of carving off that first chapter is it's a momentous sort of hero's quest moment of making the transition from this ambiguity and this chaos to something like a structure. And it's going to be one of the hardest transitions that you make, but one that's going to make the next 2 chapters far, far, far easier to handle. Because once you've done one and you've gone through that process, you begin to understand the quantity and level of work that's going to go into the next 2. Now, that's not linear. It doesn't get easier. In fact, the last chapters are often the hardest because chances are you've left the sloppiest, messiest parts of your house to the last part to work on. So the first one is the lowest hanging fruit. What do I think I know the most? What have I seen a lot of nodding heads when I talk about it? What have I maybe been invited to a panel to discuss? And I'm going to say, this is what I want to present on. That's the first chapter. Then the second and third are often the next most obvious sort of demarcations. And then 4 and 5 are like, I don't even know. The good thing is, though, that the transition to the next phase is not, from nothing to table of contents to 1 chapter to 3 chapters to all of them. In fact, lots of stuff can happen in one's career when one only has 2 complete chapters. 2, 3, and 4 chapters is a sufficient zone to be at least competitive, have a chance of possibility of competitiveness within the overall sort of field. Now, depending on your subfield, depending on the kinds of departments you're applying to, depending on your time period, there are, of course, wildly different economic sort of situations going on across the board. But the basic fact of the matter is, and of course, there is a backlog of attempted applicants who have not secured a position, who are then going to reapply, which means that a person with 3 chapters is going to be up against those with complete dissertations. That's a reality we have to face. But by the time you start to get to 3 completed or drafted chapters or thereabouts, you are now in a position to really start conceptualizing what the next phase will be. And the reason is that by that point, you are starting to get a more or less a near complete picture of what the shape of your overall argument is going to be. And you start to have the capacity to present your work with a kind of coherence and a kind of confidence that is almost impossible to do when you only have 1 chapter. And to put it simply, when you start to have 2 or 3 chapters in the can, that's when during a Q&A at a talk, people can come at you from a variety of angles that are not technically covered by the talk you just gave, and you will have a deep reserve of knowledge and understanding and questions that you have thought about a lot that you can draw upon and say, that's a great question. I don't cover it in this talk, but blah, 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 blah. I have just indicated to you that I've thought long and hard about that question. And that's when people in the audience start to say, okay, there is a real depth here. This person didn't just give me everything they have, and then they have nothing else. They have a deep reserve of consideration and thought about this process. And that really matters as well. So the other process also is, I think I would link up the question of ABD and the strategies of, say, finishing and defense to come back to that earlier point that I made about what exactly a dissertation is. So when a person thinks of a dissertation as a book, that becomes a major obstacle towards the completion of the dissertation because they have fundamentally misunderstood what it is that they're there to do. And you probably have heard an instructor or faculty member make this kinds of joke, but I'm going to make it again. It's either a good dissertation is a done dissertation, or you're like, every first draft is a piece of crap. So if you have just written a piece of crap, congratulations, like that's what you were supposed to do. So there is this irreverence it's very valuable to summon when thinking of the dissertation and thinking of it as a genre of writing that is incomplete by design. It is incomplete by design. And so read more dissertations. If you are having trouble with perfectionism, where the perfect is the enemy of the good, I come back to the advice of try to track down, either through your university special collections or maybe a more senior colleague who might be willing to share it with you. Start looking at dissertations in your department rather than, and put aside the books for a second. And you will see how loosely written, how waterlogged, how sort of sometimes out of order this genre of writing can be. And then realize that that is actually, as imperfect as it is, what you are after. And that there are going to be opportunities, whether for the revision for articles or for the book manuscript, that you are going to have to turn this into the kind of thing that you read, that we have all read on all of our syllabi throughout our adult lives, which is the book or the published peer-reviewed article. They are not the same thing. So that's one check, I think, on the perfectionism of finishing with an ABD. Let me just go back to, let's see. Yep. No, I understand that. So Gosh just realized you get UK your ABD from day one of the PhD. Yep. And that's, I think that is fine, because we remember that my wife came up through the Italian Academy, and so there is, of course, the coursework phase. It's just that the coursework phase is the MA phase, which almost everybody, at least in Italian academia now, does. Like, it's just people sort of go into MAs as part of it. And in many cases, it's not uncommon for someone to continue on with the same advisor, the same MA advisor, to move into maybe a relationship in PhD. So there, it's sort of like a different way of cutting up the pie. The German institution obviously has its extra dimension of what the dissertation means with regard to the next project and so forth. But I still think the coursework phase and then the dissertation phase question of transitioning into a position of being something more like a junior colleague than a student still holds in programs where one is dissertating from the beginning, because they've done the coursework, graduate level coursework, at some other point, typically along the line. So with regard to turning the thesis into a book, Lance, thesis into book, maybe does everyone here know, how a bill becomes a law, how a book is made? Do you feel like you have a confident sense of what that timeline looks like, or would it be valuable just to hear it laid out? Sorry to rely on chat so much, but great. Okay. So in a nutshell, I'll just give you the sort of outline of this. The publishing process to turn a dissertation into a book can begin in one of two places, depending on how you want to think of it. The first phase, I would argue, is that, and I've made this recommendations elsewhere, is that the moment that if you haven't done it already and started to build up a network outside of your own institution, that the defense of a dissertation gives you the perfect cover to cold call people, to cold email people and introduce yourself. Because as scary as more senior colleagues might seem to be, and especially if you've read their work and you think of them as intelligent and therefore they're going to be even scarier. I remember before I met Ken Pomerantz, I thought he would be terrifying. Before I met Chakrabarti, I thought he was going to be terrifying. And they're just like gentle, sweet people. Gail Hirschhatter is like, so that's a very natural thing. But there is this, people love good news. And especially, if they don't love good news, then it's good to know they don't love good news, because they're a jerk and you should probably avoid them. But 99.9% of people in this field are genuinely good, I believe. And it's hard to not, respond when someone says, here's a picture of my baby, basically. And so the dissertation defense I just defended is a really wonderful way, if you haven't already, to start the process of saying, hi, I exist. Can I talk to you? And even, would you perhaps consider, I know it's a big ask and there's really no timeline here, would you by chance have time to look at this, to look at my dissertation? I'm in the process of talking with editors and things, and I just, I'd really, really benefit, even if it's just one chapter of it. And you would be surprised. People have now written to me and said, thank you for suggesting that I made that advice, because I just bit the bullet and did that. And then 3 people said yes. And now 3, medium career, high ranking career, whatever, maybe early career, people you admire, whose work you admire, said yes. And now they're reading my dissertation and they're going to give me comments. And I'll speak for myself. I got so much more commentary on my dissertation from that process than I did from my dissertation defense, which virtually I got none. And the reason that matters is fourfold, is that in essence, that can trigger a pre-peer review process where you can get what in theory the dissertation defense is supposed to give you, which is your first basically reader reports, but before they cost you anything. This is just people saying, here, this is where I would consider, you need to strengthen this. I don't buy this. This is wonderful. This, you might need to add a chapter here. Have you considered the literature of so-and-so? That kind of a thing. You can engineer and create a peer review process that is sort of lower stakes yourself by doing this. If you have access to any kind of funding, by which I mean in the level of like USD 1,000, 2,000, that range, like small grant funding, you might even be able to develop your own manuscript workshop where you quite literally ask 2 people from maybe your home institution and then 2 people that are visiting to really sit down and spend the day with your work. I've taken part in that from both sides of the equation. I think it's one of the greatest and most useful applications of money in academia, is that, even more so than in many cases, like visiting scholars. I think a manuscript workshop is more productive intellectually than paying for someone to fly across the world and eat chicken and talk for 45 minutes. I think that a manuscript workshop is actually something that gets people jobs, gets people job security, makes their books better, helps them get tenure and so forth. But in any event, these are things that really is where the transition starts. The technical beginning part is when you start to flirt with editors. And it really is a sort of low level, very low stakes, kind of hi, I exist way of interacting. It is not a, this is what I work on, this is everything I do. If I just attach my entire dissertation, would you make it, do you want this? It's not, whoa, it's not like that. It's, hi, I exist. Generally, this is what I work on. I'm just wondering, when the time comes that I have a manuscript, is this something that you could imagine being interested in for any of the series, on the title? I think I think it connects really well with a number of the other authors that I know of you've published, such and such, but it's an initial inquiry, and I exist. And that process of kind of getting on the radar of an editor can be a 1, 2, even 3-year process, because editors have these elephantine memories where they literally will remember, or at least pretend that they remember, that you reached out to them and said, hi, my name is, and I work on, and they say like, yeah, get back in touch with me when you're done. And they literally mean it, that in 2 years' time, it would be weird to say to an average human being, hi, we met in a hallway 2 years ago, and you said like, yeah, we should get lunch sometime. It's 2 years later. Do you want to get lunch? That would be weird. That would be socially awkward. If you do that with an editor, they're like, oh yeah, I remember that conversation. Great. I'm so glad to hear it. I'd love to hear more about it. Can you remind me a bit more, whatever? That's when the publication process begins. The first benchmark is when you have the green light from the editor to say, we would seriously consider sending your project out for review. That's the first commitment of publishing. I, the editor, having looked at what you have provided me, either in some sort of manuscript draft form or sample chapters plus a book proposal, I have read it an N of 1. Maybe I've consulted with one other person, and I commit. This is spoken, probably email. I commit to sending it out for review. That's a major hurdle, and that's where many people fall off. Then they send it out. You wait for however long, And this, by the way, is another moment where your intellectual network that you've been building up along the way matters. Because if the world at large is aware of your existence, and then that editor writes to any one of the people who is aware that you exist and maybe has even read your dissertation, they are going to be probabilistically more likely to say, yes, I have time in my extremely busy schedule to review this manuscript for you, if they are already familiar with the work. And at that point, someone who's read the dissertation and is now reading the manuscript, they're going to be looking to see whether or not you incorporated their feedback. And if you did, they're going to feel a sense of ownership and a sense of like, good, this person's a serious scholar. They don't just take advice and throw it out the window. And you have just probabilistically increased the possibility of a detailed manuscript, a timely manuscript review, the person simply saying yes to the doing the manuscript review, which is the hardest job of an acquisition editor, is to get reviewers to say yes, and maybe even a positive, yes, I recommend this with some revisions for publication. That is the big moment when you receive the reader reports from the press, and hopefully they line up into something positive that is generally favorable. At that point, you write what is called an author letter, in which you take the critiques and the praise and the criticism of these reader reports, you schematically triage them, you massage them rhetorically, and you put them into a 2 or 3 or 4 page author letter where you communicate to the editor and the press what of this critical advice you plan to incorporate and how, what of the critical advice you politely disagree with and are not going to change your intellectual agenda, but it's an honest point of disagreement. I hear the critique, but there are reasons why I'm doing this. And then, of course, sort of trumpeting those moments where a person has praised you and doing it in a way that you have to showcase it, but you don't want to be too rah-rah about yourself. You give that to the press, they turn all of that package into something that they turn over to their advisory board or to their press director. And that's the person who says, we formally offer you a contract for publication. Then you do the revisions that you just have promised. So this is revision of dissertation number 2 already. Now you're revising your dissertation into a book for the second time, Microsoft Word still, or Scrivener, whatever you use. I highly recommend Scrivener. Then you submit that at your revisions, and that can take 6 months, a year. Then you get copy edits back from the press, still as track change typically within Word. And you get revision of dissertation into book chance number 3. We're talking like major revisions. You can't change like the whole argument. You can't like, your dissertation was about human-animal relations in the Ming, and then you make it about like K-pop. You can't do that, because then the press is like, no, I'm sorry, we don't have authorization to give you a contract on a completely different subject. But as long as you're in the zone, you could replace every second word of that manuscript and it would still be under contract. Then you hand in that, and then they send you back the page proofs. That's the moment. There can be even one more revision in there, but that's the moment after 3 revisions of the dissertation into a book. There's not just one, there are 3 revisions of the dissertation into a book. That's the moment, on that 4th moment, when you cannot change anything but typos. That's when it's chiseled in stone. So the reason I bring that out is not so you just know the process and also how long it is, but to really completely explode the anxiety that there is such a thing as the dissertation to the book transition, when in fact there are 3 of them spaced out by months and years. That's why also as grad students, it is pointless to compare your dissertation writing to a book, because a book has already gone through all of that stuff. It's like if, I don't know, caterpillars compared themselves to butterflies. It's just like, it's just a different stage. It's just different. It's not better or worse. It's just completely different. All right, where are we now? Where are we now in people's thinking? I'm going to pause until I hear some chatter. Oh, we got some. Is it reasonable to take apart the dissertation to publish several articles? Yeah, does anyone else worry about this? I think that, publishing in grad school, what to do with that is something that comes on people's minds. So I will, unless I hear otherwise. Okay, so I know I'm going to really encourage everyone here to, I said before, the biggest hurdle in the first phase of the dissertation of grad school is constantly trying to re-perform your intelligence and reapply and, prove how smart you are, and name drop and whatnot, and that gets in the way. Ironically, I think at the tail end of grad school, a different kind of thing comes into play where it's where you kind of have lost faith even your ability to convince anyone that you're smart anymore. Like, it's sort of like, okay, now everyone kind of knows. And I bring that up in the realm of publications because I see a lot of grad students make poor strategic decisions about where to give the fruits of their labor, meaning a chapter, an article length thing. There are conferences which will, I'm not saying that this is universally something I recommend against, but what I invite is really hard thinking and a kind of faith in yourself. But if you haven't published anything and you get invited to a large international conference with 500 people that as a systematic part of the conference requires or assumes that every participant will be there, they'll write something and it will go into a proceedings that will be like 4,000 pages, a 4,000 page PDF that like no one will see. And that one is really locking in a piece of writing within that context. That's when you really want to take a step. Even if you're invited to join an edited volume and by a prominent person in the field, you really want to take a step back and say something to the extent of this: wow, if someone is asking me to be part of an edited volume, maybe this piece is good enough to go through the peer review process at one of the mid to top tier journals in my field. Why not? Who's to say that I am not worthy of that? And the reason is that peer review is the coin of the realm. And edited, we've heard it many times, like when search committees, but even when just generally, I think the intellectual community looks at an article by an author in a peer-reviewed journal versus a chapter in an edited volume. These are different ontologically different things, and structurally different things as well. A peer-reviewed article in a mid to top tier journal has gone through the gauntlet of peer review, maybe through revise and resubmit. It is an achievement. There is something that has happened that is undeniable when one makes it into, any number of journals that we could mention. If someone's in an edited volume, it's hard to know whether or not they. I've put it this way elsewhere, so I'll just put it this way. If you're in an edited volume with a bunch of famous authors, then chances are, if your piece was sort of, middle of the road, like it was good, but it was, wasn't basically cutting edge or anything, there is almost zero chance that the publisher of that edited volume is going to cancel the publication because of your chapter. That your chapter can sort of sneak in under the radar of, suboptimal work, but still make it into the final publication because it's in the same, bus as these luminaries at that, and the luminaries are, for a variety of reasons, and maybe some really stellar chapters are the reason why the publisher wants to go with this edited volume. So this brings to mind that job search committees, postdoc review committees, the field at large has a tougher time understanding how to interpret an edited volume chapter, or certainly a preceding style publication, than it does with an article in a peer-reviewed journal. But what I see sometimes is that and I totally get this because I still feel it to this day. It's like somebody wants me. That's wow. Like this is such a rare thing. Like, yes. And oh my gosh, look, I'll be in the same table of contents as person X, Y, or Z. And I suspend my critical faculties and also my confidence in myself to say, wait a minute. I only get a very limited number of chapters from a dissertation to publish. And I would say that no more than 2 of your chapters from your dissertation do you want to commit to any publication before the book. Otherwise, you scare away publishers, because why would they want to publish you if you have already published all of the chapters as articles? Because that means that people can get your stuff effectively for free if they have an institutional subscription. So if I get 2, then I need to think about this. And I did this. I talked about this with a student of mine who was doing stellar work, really amazing work, cutting edge, and got invited to an edited volume. And I said, listen, it's your decision. It's, you have to be the one to make this decision. I would say go for, I can't remember if it was Journal of Asian Studies or if it was like, Modern China. I was like, go for it. Go for AHR, go for the American Historical Review. If you've just been asked to publish this thing in this edited volume and there's this kind of thing, why not? The edited volume is going to take longer to come out than an AHR volume. An AHR, you are going to not make it on the first try. And there's going to be a revise and resubmit. There might be 2 or 3 revise and resubmits. But if that takes 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, it'll still come out before this edited volume. And it will be a total coup d'etat for your career. It will be a publication in a journal that carries this kind. And there, of course, not just those 2, there are a dozen that we could list. And even if they reject you, then you could go down, the tier system of journals and say, okay, I want to go after, I got rejected from JAS, so I'm going to go after X, Y, or Z. It still could come out before that edited volume and will still carry with it far more intellectual value and career value than going with an edited volume. With an edited volume, you get far less feedback too. A peer-reviewed process, you're going to get a lot of feedback from peer review. That's going to strengthen your analysis. And you have to ask yourself, so you're like, okay, how fast do I need this publication out? If I go with an edited volume, it's still not going to be out by the time I'm on a job search. So that means I've got time. So if I've got time and I have confidence in myself that I have a piece that's really strong, who am I to deny myself the possibility of publishing in a top journal? Let them tell me no. I shouldn't say no to myself. Now, if anyone here is later in career and you're coming up for tenure review and you're like, I need something, then of course your time frame is different. And you might not have the time to go after JAS or an AHR. You might have to go after a tier 2 in your field or in your subfield, but where the value is that this is still a very strong journal with high visibility, but because they don't have 1 million submissions per season, that maybe the review process and a commitment would come sooner, an under contract kind of thing for my CV. But that's the part. So no more than 2, I would say, but don't just give this stuff away to anyone who comes knocking at your door out of this anxiety that maybe that's the last chance you would have, or I should settle for whatever I'm offered. Bet on yourself, I would say, and realize that you're going to kind of regret it later on when your chapter that you really actually believe is really, is strong, is locked inside a $150 edited volume on Brill. And no shade to Brill. I love Brill. But, it's a chapter inside an unaffordable volume versus, you name it, late imperial China or modern Chinese language and culture, whatever it might be. All right. So let's see. Curious. All right. Get something out, but keep working on the book. Okay. Curious about tenure clock and how dissertation book revision should map onto that schedule if you have recommendations. This is a really good question. So if the dissertation, the job of the dissertation is to do it, and what the dissertation does is gets you the PhD, in most of it, actually, for the first time, I'm talking with just, my siblings here in our field. The book is tenure. The book is that, you need, and I have to make it apologies to anyone coming through the German system whose system is like still to this day abstruse to me. It's like me trying to figure out how cricket is played, even though I played baseball. I just cannot wrap my mind around it. Anyway, the point of the book from a career standpoint is tenure. But there's this extra dimension of the book plus what is always institutionally listed in the vaguest of terms. And in the North American context, it goes something like this: significant progress towards a second book, or indication of progress towards a second book. What does that mean, and what is that about? And how does that then factor into your strategy about how long can I give myself for the dissertation revision process to still be reasonable? First of all, there is no quantifiable way to measure significant progress. But the good thing is that you can completely lie. So when you talk about your second project for a postdoc application, or your second project, what it's going to be for a job application, they're complete and utter fictions, lies, nonsense. Most people don't do them. It's theater. And it's important theater. It's meaningful theater. It can't just be chaos. But this is to say that I don't know for sure. I'm just going to I would bet that 90% of people's second projects on their job applications never materialize. Or if they do, they're like project 5, somewhere down their career if they live long enough, in some highly transmuted form. And so when you are, that's the earlier phase, but when you are starting down the tenure process, that's when this second project needs to take on a bit more, and in some cases much more, depending on if you're at an R1 university. I would say it has to have a lot more shape. And so that might take the form of a peer-reviewed article that is actually about the second project. It might be draft chapters. It might be a full manuscript, in some cases, a draft manuscript. There is no concrete guidance when it comes to that. My view, and all of this is just one person's view, but my view is that issue of second project and tenure review should factor into your ABD to early career process in the following way, which is, it is risky to take too long on that revision process, simply put. That risk can pay off if that extra time translates into a first book of just magnum opus, field-changing proportions, where everyone who reads that manuscript can feel what went into it and realize that, yes, this person might not be as far along on a second project as we've seen with other candidates, but that's because we have in our hands here a book that has defined a field. I wouldn't be surprised. It would have been interesting to sit in on like the tenure discussions for Dwara, for example, with the North China book. I have to imagine that, I don't know where, how long did Dwara's second book take? A long time to come out. And so, but the first one was of such proportions that you have to assume that people were like, we can see where the time went. There are cases, however, where people produce books that, because of the time that is taken to produce them in that revision process, can almost become their own worst critics, by which I mean someone holds the book in their hand. I don't have a prop book. Someone holds the book in their hand and says like, it's good. This book is good, it makes a contribution. I cannot wrap my head around why this took 7 more years. And it's not because the person was struggling to find editors or this, or, you know, they or had a personal life crisis or something changed or whatever. It was simply, it took a really, really long time. And there's nothing to show for it, to put it very bluntly. That's the moment in which the book can sort of become the thing that punctures the hull of the ship. Because not only is it not evident where all that time went, but it can also, it then systematically, because there are only 24 hours in a day, means that by definition, less time went into working on the second project. And so in concrete terms, for example, in some institutions, there might be a pre-tenure sabbatical or a pre-tenure teaching relief. And if you get one of those, then, and that's it before tenure, then you really have to ask yourself, and let's say it happens in the 3rd year of the position, the 4th year of the position, in some North American, I think, academy would probably be like after reappointment. So like 4th year. If you're using that 4th year, still revising your first book, that has to be a decision that is very carefully made, because that means you're not using that to do archival work, to do the hard work, the ground laying work of the second project. And as we all know, once you're teaching, you're teaching. You know, it's, you know, you're not going to steal away and do a bit of archive, especially within, and this is where it's really, really relevant to us in this conversation. You're not just going to jump on a plane and do a little dabble of work at, I don't know, Sichuan Provincial Archive. That doesn't work that way. You could like jaunt over to the British Library and, you know, check on a footnote if you want. There is no jaunting, as we know, to Chinese archives. It is something that requires time and now even more sensitivity and access issues. So that's where I think those two issues coincide, and some serious thinking has to be done of what is the point of this first book. And I mean, my first book had, my dissertation, my first book had zero chance, none whatsoever, of becoming a, I keep coming back to Dwara because we know that book was his first book, his dissertation first book, and then it wins the Levinson, but it had no chance of being that kind of book, none. And so a decision that I think I'm proud of making in my career is that I did not entertain the fantasy that it would. I'm proud of that book. It sort of did its job, but, you know, the length of it, it's like the size of a long master's thesis. But it did the job. It made its contribution. It won some awards, but that wasn't the point. And then I spent my 4th year, actually I spent years 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All the grants that I got basically as an assistant professor all went towards Chinese typewriter. And that was the one that took me 10 years to write, 70 archives. And I couldn't have just rushed it at the end. Yeah. Cool. All right. So let's see, 2 questions here. Yeah. So let's see. Could you talk a bit about mental health, not only for ABDs, but also early career? And then if there's still time, can you take a bit about building mentorship relationships? Not everyone has an opportunity to find good mentor at their own institution. Do you think there's a way to compensate for that? Great question. Since I mentioned teaching, what is your experience in turning teaching seminars into research opportunities? Awesome. These are great questions. So thank you for these, because at least I know there's one person who needs this, and that makes me feel, okay. So let me talk about mentorship relationships. I'm going to be very sort of blunt. So Stanford is considered, you know, R1 top tier university. And I really, when I visit institutions, get the vibe from colleagues at other institutions who don't have the same Times higher education ranking. I often get the vibe that there is an assumption that I carry around, an assumption of like status consciousness, and that this place must have less going on here by virtue of its ranking. I see that in faculty. I see that in librarians and archivists. I see that in grad students. And it is universally, let me think back to my life, universally wrong. And in fact, the opposite is true, is that some places where I go to like higher ranked places than Stanford, I will often think, there's actually very little of interest going on here. I won't say that out loud, but I will say, wow, actually my visit to my visit to institution X in country Y that has ranking whatever, and also sort of seems to have anxiety about that, had a far richer, more dynamic set of conversations that I witnessed, a far better Q&A, a far better series like lunch discussion than anything that I experienced at fill in the blank, Harvard, Yale, excuse me. And what I want to say in these meetings, but I don't know how to say it, and that's why I'm saying it sort of here, and it sounds weird, is the faster that one can not get rid of that feeling, because I don't believe in getting rid of this. Actually ties into questions of mental health. When someone's anxious or depressed, the worst advice you could give them is calm down or cheer up. Like, you know, just eradicate that and cut that out like it's some sort of, you know, thing that can be removed. The advice is always the same: is establish a relationship with that. You need to establish a meta relationship with that part of you. That part of you needs to be invited to the dinner table of your life. Every meal, you have to invite your depression to dinner. You have to invite your anxiety to dinner. It's part of you. It's a member of your family. You don't get to send, you know, crazy Uncle Bill to the garage because he doesn't present well at dinner events. And the same thing with these kinds of anxieties, because I can think of scholars who I consider to be among the most prolific, not only in publication, but also in their mentorship of students, in their forming of conferences, in their just generally being this vibrant part of our field, who, if they actually had fallen victim to that mentality, by which I mean failed to form a relationship with that mentality and thought of themselves as, oh, I'm not in Rome. Like, I'm not in Paris. I'm not in New York. I'm far away from the centers of fashion. So I just have to give up. If this person bought into that, instead of having a relationship with that thought, then this person would have done nothing of what they've done. I'm not going to say the person, but this is not to say that real institutional inequalities don't exist of funding and access. And I'm not saying that those things don't exist, but I would say that among the most dynamic places that I have ever had the honor of like having a week to partake in are not the ones that we expect. Really not the ones we expect. Sometimes they are. It turns out that I never witnessed Hopkins Graduate School as an undergrad, but then I went there, I was visited back and I met their grad students. And that actually is a weirdly like you kind of would expect it to be. And it turns out to be. Chicago, I think, is a place that is sort of actually, what it kind of claims to be. And then for the most part, I think that there's a lot of sort of R1 complacency, where in fact, and I think I count Stanford here as well. I once went to a talk by Benedict Anderson, when he came to talk before his death, and I was the only historian in the audience. It was like, this is absurd. Like, everyone should be here to hear this. One time, Prasenjit Dwara came to give a talk, and many of us in Sinology found out about it the day before. And it's like, there's something broken about this culture. There's something broken about this intellectual culture. Whereas you go to another institution and Anderson or Dwara or Hershatter is going to show, and it's like the room is just bumping, it's humming, and there's like this energy, and there's like this sense of it. I want to be part of this conversation. And that to me is where you want to do one's thinking. this is where I get to the question of mentorship relations, which is that when someone does not establish a relationship with the understandable complexes which can come with feeling that they are far from the centers of fashion, inferiority complex, I'll just name it. When there is that, a person can actually prevent themselves from feeling that they have the license to building that network, to reaching out and saying hi, I exist, this is what I work on, under the assumption that they don't have time for me, this would seem out of sorts, whatever it is. And I think that as anxiety producing and as weird as it feels to cold email somebody, again, I'll come back to this belief, which I've seen reconfirmed over and over and over again. 99.9% of the people, regardless of where they are actually genuinely good and want good things. And they're just, they can't know that you exist until they know you exist. And so you could leave that to chance. You could leave it to chance encounters by way of things, but I'm all for one that give chance what is chances, and then try to leave as little to chance that is not chance's job. That's not chance. It's, a lot of it is chance, but not all of it is. And to the best of your ability, if you can send an email to someone whose work you really admire and say, listen, I know that it's a long shot, but any chance that I'm coming through town, or if you're coming through, or here's my work, or I see that this is one thing I've never seen anyone do, and I don't know why. If you have the fortune to be accepted to a panel, to a conference that you really are excited about, how many of you would reach out, would go through the conference bulletin when they send it to you? Now, I guess it's PDF mainly. Go through the conference bulletin, be like, who's going, who's presenting, or who's chairing? Oh my gosh, they're going to be there. 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 I am going to email them 2 months in advance of the panel, of the conference, and say, hi, I know this is really, really out of the blue. I'm part of a panel that's meeting on Friday morning at 11. And your work has been really influential for me. And I don't know if you have any other prior engagements, but it would mean so much to be able to share my work with you and maybe, talk with you afterwards. All that they might say, thank you so much. My advisee is presenting at that time, so I'm so sorry, but they'll still know you exist, but they'll come. They will come. I did that the first time I presented at AAS. I did it as a grad student. It was actually a mistake to do that as a grad student, but I did it as a grad student, and I wrote to everybody under the sun who I thought, and in the audience was like, for me at that time, very important. It was like, I think, Jonathan Lippman, Steve Harrell, Louisa Shine, I think maybe came. And it's just because they were like, no one's ever asked me to come. And then we talked, and then we stayed in touch, and they became part of my mentor network. I sort of did that because I didn't know you're not supposed to do it. And so what I'd like to convince everybody here is, if you think you're not supposed to do stuff like that, don't literally, but sort of, you want to brain damage that cell that carries the belief that you're not supposed to do that, and just make the mistake of reaching out in this way, and you'll find far more good people than you will not. And that's the process of building your mentorship network. It's human. And here I'll say something else. Don't be sociopathic about it. Don't do it in a way that's like, I'm already chess gaming out what I want from you. It's still career building. That's fine. There's no problem with building your careers, but do it so far in advance of any possibility of needing anything from anyone that it's just a human encounter. It's just a human encounter. And maybe, who knows, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you might need to ask them, would you write a letter for me? Or would you maybe look at this thing? And they won't think of you as this sort of, transactional sociopathic person, as long as it's sort of this long, why are we doing this? I want to meet the people whose writing I admire. And of course that has utility to me. I'm not going to deny that it does, but I have nothing specific that I want from you. I just want to, you know, have you come to my panel or have a coffee or something of that nature. So yeah, let's see. Cool. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Yang Dai. That's nice. And then let's see, building, teaching to research. Oh yes, mental health, not only ABDs, but also early career. So I think maybe someone in the audience has seen what, at least some of the videos that I've done. One of them is, oh my gosh, what time is it? Wow, we're really cooking here. Okay. I guess this is an important one, so I will focus on this before we depart. And then please, let me just put my email address in here. If anyone wants to get in touch. I from 5th, 6th year of my PhD all the way through basically year 2 of assistant professor, I was in really bad shape. I was dealing with panic attacks on a nightly basis. If anyone's ever gone through that, you'll know that it's like a nightmare, but you're awake. It's really something else. I was in class teaching during panic attacks, like in a lecture talking about God knows what about Maoism. And I was like, in thought in my head is like, oh my God, here we go. And like, I was living in 2 realities simultaneously, of like this classroom of students talking about the Great Leap Forward, maybe, and then terror, pure horror. And at the same time, it was a really, really bad situation. And what it took me a long time to understand, and I actually give a major credit to a roommate of mine, or a housemate. When I first started at Stanford, I had like $5 in my bank account and about like an ungodly amount of credit card debt. And I was living with 7 other people because in this sort of commune kind of house, because it was both good and also because I couldn't afford anything else. And there was one fellow who said, listen, my ex-girlfriend is a physical therapist, a massage therapist. I really recommend that you start. And that was my bridge into therapy. Therapy was something about reconnecting with the body. And that's when I started far too late in life to realize that, because if anyone here has gone through that, I think it's shocking to realize that it's not your mind, it's still your body, but that your body in this cognitive, mental, emotional way can just revolt against you in this very apparent, it's over kind of way. Like, I'm not going to wait a second longer for you to disregard me. It's over. In my case, panic. It's something to witness the body revolt against you, in the same way that if you were to, you know, smoke 2 packs a day, eventually your lungs revolt against you. Your body revolts against you. And in that metaphor, it's like, it took a long time to realize what I said before about this creation of a relationship with this dimension of me. At the beginning, I wanted to just get rid of it. And I realized that actually just brought it back more ferociously. It was sort of angry at me for wanting to get rid of it, because it's like, you're me, I'm you, you don't get to do that. And so this comes back to the notion that, you know, if grad school, if I'm saying like, find out where the laundry is, find out where the gym is, find out what mental health services are and how to access them. And then hopefully you don't need them, maybe. Same thing when you join a postdoc, same thing when you start a career, is it starts day one. It's one of the first things that you need to know and have in your repertoire. And you should consider it just like physical activity and a diet and like getting outside and checking your posture. It's just something that we need to form as part of our everyday lives. Probably now more than ever, I would say. Yeah. And then just the last few seconds before I have to go and teach, I hope this has been even remotely helpful in any fragmentary way. If there's stuff that's really burning that was left over, let me know. If there's anything about this that missed the mark, or that you don't quite get or buy something and want to ask, please do get in touch, or directly or by way of the series. And it's just a real pleasure to speak with you all.
Okay, thank you so much for this interesting talk. I feel like everyone is very happy with the information they got today.
Sure.
And I just want to remind everyone that this project is not funded, so our speakers participate just out of their love of sharing knowledge. So thanks again, Professor Milani, and thank you for everyone for coming, and goodbye.